He stepped out of his rental car and into a strip of winter air that smelled faintly of fryer oil and wet pavement. The Harvest Lane Beastro sign buzzed over the sidewalk, its warm lettering trying to promise hospitality in a part of town that had started to forget the word. Richard Holston walked under that hum with his jacket collar up, a baseball cap pulled low, a cheap name tag that read, Mark, stuck crookedly on his chest. He had rehearsed the face of a trainee, the half-smile that invited questions but gave none. He had rehearsed looking for the kinds of failures a busy owner could fix with a memo or a meeting. He thought he was walking into complacency. He thought he might find shortcuts, a slow crew, empty plates in the walk-in. He did not think, not for an instant, that at 3 a.m. he would find a black chef working alone, and that looking at him would upend the tidy little plan Richard had driven in to execute. The dining room was a dark rectangle of abandoned chairs, and one half-lit booth, where a late-night diner had left a coffee ring on the table. A security camera blinked in the corner, like a quiet, useless eye. Richard moved past the cold hostess stand, and into the back where the hum behind the walls lived. The refrigerators, the fryer's slow sigh, the steady heartbeat of the kitchen. At first it was the sound that caught him. A soft, steady tapping. Tap, tap, tap. A knife on a board kept time with breath. The sound was so practical, so mundane, that it would have been easy to pass by without a thought. But it pulled him the way a single light draws a moth. He followed it. The prep room smelled of onions and citrus and a faint lingering of char. The light there was a single bulb over a stainless prep table, haloing a man slouched at the edge of competence and exhaustion. He chopped with a rhythm carved out of necessity, efficient, economical, the cuts the product of practice. His apron was frayed at the edges. A strip of cloth was tied around one hand. A plastic container sat beside him with a small stack of sliced fruit and a handwritten label. A radio murmured some late-night station low enough to keep the silence company. Richard's first thought was managerial. Why are you here so late? His second, quieter, was a recognition of talent. Even in the tiredness, the young man moved like he had time and ownership in his hands. His knife didn't hiss. It sang. The mise en place was precise. The line in the jacket he wore, even stained, sat like armor on someone who had learned to take care of things the way other people learn to pay bills. He was maybe 20-something, shoulders coiled with responsibility. He was black. He was working at 3 a.m. Haven't seen you on this shift before, Richard said, letting his voice drop into the practiced tone of the new guy. The man didn't look up immediately. He kept his rhythm, let the knife answer, then glanced over, eyes cautious. He nodded once. Yeah, he said. Just a temp tonight. Name? Richard asked. Darius, he said. Darius Cololton. Long night. Darius shrugged, an almost defiant smallness to it. Long days, too. Depends on how you count 'em. Richard watched him. Up close, the lines around Darius's eyes weren't age lines so much as mapped hours. There was a small sheen where the light struck his cheekbone. His hands were steady, despite the bandage at the knuckle. He worked like someone who'd learned to make the small country of his life orderly, because the rest of it had been chaotic. You're good, Richard said, because it was true and because the truth sometimes opens doors people keep shut with politeness. Darius's mouth tightened at the compliment. I do what I can, he said. Been cooking since I was a kid. Helps me think straight. You go to school? Richard asked, letting the question be casual, not prying. Darius set down the knife and wiped his hands on the frayed apron. He hesitated a beat that felt like an answer in itself. Nah, he said finally. Never made it to college. He said the words with a kind of quiet finality that hung there like a judgment. Richard felt the title of the story settle around them. Undercover boss, out at night, sees a black chef working at 3 a.m., then discovers why he never went to college. The sentence didn't need embellishment. It contained the hook, the promise, the reason Richard had driven across town with a fake name on his chest. It demanded an explanation, and in the way that stories did, that explanation would arrive in small human increments, not in lists of facts, but in messy, essential details. The radio clicked to static, and then a voice came on with a slow, patient announcer reading the weather someplace warmer. Darius reached for a damp towel and pressed it against his forehead for a moment. He kept his movements economy perfect, no wasted motion. There was a faint scar at the base of one thumb, a pale triangle that told of some other accident undergone without ceremony. "You never went because you didn't want to?" Richard tested. Darius looked away. "No. I had plans. Used to." He laughed then, a sound that contained a memory. "You don't just stop wanting, man. Sometimes you start doing the thing that keeps the lights on." There it was, the start of an arc that could have been 1,000 pages long if he let it. Richard let the silence fill. This was where most people built walls. This was where others offered a sandwich and a quick superficial empathy. He knew both moves. He'd made them both before. A faint creak echoed, soft, then a small muffled sound from the storage room. Darius's shoulders tightened into a protective posture. His hand went to the prep table, but not to finish the cut. He moved in the way of someone trained by necessity to react before panic spread. The storage room door eased open, and a tiny figure slipped out, small, wrapped in a hoodie that swallowed her, her hair still rumpled from sleep, blinking as if she had been watching the night in half attention. She was 10, Richard thought, no older, no younger. A pack of crayons peeped from her small backpack. Her eyes found the knife on the board and flicked away immediately. She had a child's habit of waiting to be noticed, as if the world might forget to notice her unless she brightened. "Darius," she whispered. The name carried the world's final gentleness. "Lonnie." Darius's voice changed when he said it. When he looked at her, his face folded into the private expression of a man who had reinvented himself to be safe for a child. The knife sat between them like a boundary. He crouched and slipped an arm around her small shoulders, drawing her closer in a motion that seemed to say, "You are not alone in this kitchen." He tucked the slice of fruit container toward her side, the one with the small handwriting on the lid. Richard had seen many forms of devotion in his career. Employees who stayed late to polish a line because of pride, managers who sacrificed their nights to defend their team's hours, cooks who straightened forks like a form of prayer. But devotion that looked like a grown man giving childhood back to a little sister felt different. It contained in its smallness both the capacity for ruin and for endurance. "Lonnie's up?" Mason's voice cut through the cramped air like a clipped knife. The shift manager stood in the doorway with a flashlight in one hand and a wry look that meant he was keeping rules as if rules were what kept him whole. He was in his 40s, neat, company polo tucked into jeans. Mason's presence was the practical reality of the business, schedules, policies, liability. He crossed his arms. "She's fine," Darius said quickly, protective. 10 seconds and he was back to contained. She was dozing. Mason's eyes flicked to the container of fruit, then to Lonnie, then to the dim corners of the storage room where mop buckets lived like forgotten sea creatures. "You know company policy," he said. His tone was not unkind, but it carried the weight of procedures written to save companies from lawsuits and managers from blame. "It'll be okay," Darius said. His words were small but fierce. "I'll clock her in. Take her out. I'll—" "Clock her in?" Mason repeated with a look that made everything between them sound fragile. "We can't have minors in the back. OSHA, liability, all that. You know this, man." Darius's jaw tightened. He put his hands on the edge of the table like he was bracing against something he couldn't see. "She's been here before," he said. "Short times. Sit in the office. She waits." "You wait at Lincoln Elementary till 3, Mason said, almost as though he were reciting options he would find acceptable. "Bring a note. Get authorization. This isn't how we run things, Darius. I can't have—" "You can't have," Darius echoed, and his voice turned on the slight edge people carry when they are protecting someone they love. He didn't argue rules with Mason. He explained life. "School's done. By the time I get off, she still hasn't nothing. Sometimes I take her to my aunt's. Sometimes—" He swallowed. The sentence collapsed. He had not rehearsed pity. He had rehearsed survival. Richard watched the exchange like someone watching a kettle come to a boil. There was a clash here between a corporate script and human improvisation. He felt the tilt in his chest that meant a decision needed to be made. He had come to harvest evidence and perhaps to trim a place that had overgrown neglect. Instead, he had been offered a portrait, a 23-year-old cook who could wield a knife with skill and tenderness, and a child who obeyed silence with the quiet stoicism of someone used to discretion. "Why didn't you go to college, Darius?" Richard asked, softening his voice into a space where confessions sometimes fell. Darius breathed out. He wrapped his fingers around the damp towel and pressed it to his forehead again. "My mom got sick," he said. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a soap opera reveal. It was the plain cause and effect that rerouted a life. At first it was this hospital thing. Then the job changed, and then... He shook his head. "I had to be around. Had to make sure Lonnie was fed. Took to school, all that. College cost money, and I couldn't be paying for classes when I couldn't even promise rent." The words came like ordinary facts. Illness, financial pressure, a child to care for. Richard had expected a list of bravado or excuses. This was closer to a ledger of obligations. There was a small, almost defiant pride in Darius's confession, an ownership of the choices he had made, not a plea for sympathy. The voice said, in the quietest possible way, "I chose to be the adult." "And your mom," Richard said, because questions help frame the story, and because sometimes the next sentence is the one that bends the arc. "She's..." Darius let that hang and tapped the board as if to cut through the sentence. "She got worse. Then she didn't come back to us the same. Missed too much. I had to." His shoulders lifted. We had to be each other's family. There it was then. A mother taken by illness, a brother stepping into the adult role, a scholarship to somewhere unused. Darius's life had rerouted from college to caregiving. The reasons were simple and heavy. Medical bills, hospital nights, a house that needed someone to be awake. He had been the person to put his own future in the back pocket to keep his sister's present stable. Richard felt the shape of what that meant. He thought briefly of his own children, how different the calculations had been in his house, and how quickly gratitude can dissolve into action when you see a person who has become a caretaker rather than a student. He also felt, almost involuntarily, the corporate mental list. Policies that protect, policies that restrict. He knew what Mason would call for. He knew what human resources would call for. He lived in the overlap between compassion and protocol. For a minute, the kitchen's only real sound was the knife. Then the radio stuttered, and a different rhythm found its way into the room. The slow squeak of a cart on tile, the click of Mason's flashlight against his palm. He looked at Darius, at Lonnie, at the labeled container of fruit. "We can't have a kid in the back at this hour," Mason said again, softer. "You know how it looks if an inspector comes in. If something happens..." "It won't happen," Darius said. His hand found the little child's and gave it a gentle squeeze. "I've been doing this for her since the last hospital. I know how to keep her safe. I make sure she eats, does homework, gets to her program in the afternoons. I'm not asking for a medal. I'm just asking to keep my job and keep my sister from..." His voice broke on the last word. Richard felt something shift in the air. Here was responsibility translated into the raw language of daily survival. The staff around them read the room. Some shifted their weight, eyes flicking from company policy to human face. The kitchen always carried a moral economy. Everyone's hours were a kind of currency. Every shift swap had a story. In this moment, the currency wasn't time. It was dignity. "You never went to college," Richard said again, not to ask but to give the sentence shape. "Because you had to take care of Lonnie." Darius swallowed. "Yeah," he said. He didn't embellish. He didn't ask for absolution. He had given up certain chances because his sister needed dinner, a school run, someone to sign for the flu shot. "I had classes lined up," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't leave her. Who would make sure she didn't miss school? Who'd pay the bills? I couldn't be the student and the parent. I chose." The weight of that choice sat in the room like a physical thing. Richard thought of the neat folders on his office desk back at headquarters, training schedules, tuition reimbursement plans, lists of people the company had helped. Those lists read like hope in an annual report, glossy and fine, but distant. This was not a line item. This was a life. There was a small practical sound, the freezer door closing. Mason shifted his weight as if to close the conversation. "I'm not trying to be heartless," he said. "We have standards." "No," Darius cut in, and for a second his voice sounded older than 23. "You're not. I'm not trying to be a rule breaker, I just—" He looked down at Lonnie, at the way she leaned into him like a weight. "I keep us together. I'm not asking for a pass, just a chance." Richard stepped back, watching the scene through the soft haze of an observer who could intervene. He could call the place and announce himself. He could let the manager sort it. He could allow policy to do the work it was designed to do, which was to protect the business at the expense of messy human lives. He could also step into his other role, the one he inhabited when he put on a different kind of hat. The employer who could choose to use the levers at his disposal to change the calculus for his worker. The decision didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, the measured clack of Darius's knife, the way Lonnie's fingers closed around the rim of the fruit container, Mason's folded arms like a barricade. It came as recognition that formal structures sometimes need to bend when individual lives are at stake, and also as the sober knowledge that bending rules without thought can create worse problems. This was not a movie where one announcement cured everything. This was a place where the right move might be one of many, not an answer to all things. "You said you used to plan for college," Richard said, leaning in as if to listen for the echo of those plans. "What did you want to study?" Darius's eyes lit up for a second, an ember that had been kept under ash. "Culinary," he said. "Actually, chef stuff. I liked the idea of learning more. The kind of kitchens where you get taught the discipline, get a certificate. But the classes cost. The certification costs. I couldn't just quit being the grown-up." There it was. Ambition, not just survival. Richard noticed the way Darius said chef like the word was a promise he kept in his pocket. Despite everything, despite the late shifts and the scrappy containers for a 10-year-old, Darius's competence was visible, the cut of the vegetable, the evenness of the slices, the way he tasted and tilted his head. He was plainly good at this. The fact of his skill was a counterweight to any narrative that might reduce him to a hardship case. Darius held mastery of his craft in a way that deserved recognition, separate from his circumstances. "Have you looked into any programs?" Richard asked. "Employer training, scholarships? There are things." Darius's laugh was quick and brittle. "I filed one application once, didn't hear back. Phones ring a lot of times for me, and it's either school or bills. Phones go to the other." "You worry about losing your job if someone finds out you've got your sister here?" Richard asked, aiming for the knot he suspected pulled this every day tighter. Darius nodded. "I worry they call social services or that they'd say I'm negligent for having her at the back. I worry they'd make us choose like some kind of law book that doesn't read us. I can't afford a fight like that. I got rent in 2 days, and my landlord ain't an idealist." The room tightened with the kind of small, practical fear that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with survival. Richard felt it as a physical pull. He could already see the corporate memos that Mason would be tempted to draft. No minors in back of house. Strict adherence to scheduling. He could also see, in his mind, a different memo. "We must provide options for employees with caregiving responsibilities." He hadn't yet decided which memo would matter more. A cook from the line drifted into the doorway and watched. She was younger than Mason, and not as practiced in reading for empathy. She kept her mouth shut, but her eyes were wide. Kitchens are ecosystems of observation. Nothing stays secret long. Richard felt the weight of those eyes, the sense that a single gesture could ripple. "How old is Lonnie exactly?" Mason asked after a beat. 10, Darius said. He kept his voice even, as if the number was just an item on a list. "She goes to Lincoln Elementary. She's in Mrs. Alvarez's class." Mason's expression shifted to a slightly softer one, the kind of human moment that policy doesn't often account for. "You can't be doing that every night," he said. If an inspector comes at 3 a.m. and there's a child in the back, our insurance could get dicey. You understand? Darius's answer was not a rebuttal of law or logistics, but an inventory of trade-offs. My options aren't the best ones. My aunt's got 3 kids. She ain't got room for one more every evening. The after-school program closes before I'm off. The kiddo gets picked up by friends sometimes. Sometimes I bring her here and try to keep it quiet. Silence fell like a blanket, the kind that feels thick in places where people have to make moral calculations when nothing in the system accounted for them. Richard thought about the thousands of employees who run his restaurants, the different shapes of their lives he had only ever seen in numbers, turnover rates, pay scales, retention percentages. They were statistics on spreadsheets until a living person stood in a prep room in the middle of the night and told the story that made those numbers ache. He walked closer to the prep table, the cheap name tag suddenly feeling too small for the complexity in the room. There was no applause, no TV crew, no theatrical reveal. Just 2 humans and a child, and the faint aroma of citrus. He wanted to be careful. He didn't want to be dramatic, to make promises he couldn't keep, to be the man who walked into a kitchen and waved a checkbook like a wand. He also did not want to walk out and let rules be the only answer. You do good work, Richard said to Darius, meaning it. We have training programs. We have ways to get people certified if they're eligible. That doesn't fix tonight, but... Darius's eyes flicked up, cautious for hope. Sometimes I hear about that stuff, he said. But you know how news is. People talk, they say apply online. But when you're 2 shifts behind on rent, apply online is a nice sentence in a brochure. The realism of Darius's statement landed like a punch. You ever ask about tuition reimbursement? Richard pushed. Have you filled out an application with HR? Darius looked at him like Richard had suggested a different planet. Didn't want to rock the boat. Don't want to draw attention if it means they take Lonnie from me. People call the social workers if they think a kid's sleeping in a storage room. I don't want someone else deciding what's best for her. There it was. Fear braided with love. Not fear of work, but fear of the system that can sometimes move with a cold, bureaucratic hand when people's lives are messy. Richard could imagine the forms, the interviews, the nights in offices lit by fluorescent lights where someone else passes judgment. He saw the hard edge in Darius's face, managing obligations by folding them neatly into daily survival, rather than raising them to be problems to be solved publicly. You're proud, Richard said, because the sentence felt necessary. You could have taken other routes and you chose this one. That takes something, Darius. Darius snorted softly, not because the statement wasn't true, but because pride was a word that fit better in a speech than in the actual day-to-day business of keeping food on the table. Proud, he said. Maybe that. Or stubborn. Or scared. Pick whichever sounds nobler. Mason cleared his throat. Look, I appreciate you stepping up for your family. We like people like that around here. But there's a line. I need to protect the restaurant, too. If we get flagged for safety violations, we could lose hours. I can't... Richard watched the manager's mouth. He could see where his own empathy could complicate Mason's position. He could imagine the cascade of HR tickets and the uncomfortable conversations. He had a choice. To keep playing the part of Mark, the trainee who notices problems and then files reports, or to step forward as Richard Holston, the owner who can choose to put resources into a messy human life. Ownership carries a particular kind of burden, the ability to act. That ability now pressed on him like a hand at his back. He had prepared for his rounds under the pretense of finding deficits. He had not prepared for the fact that one person, small, skilled, exhausted, could convert the idea of deficit into the idea of loss avoided. The longer he stood there, the clearer it was. Darius was a cook with real skill, who had sacrificed formal education to make survival possible for 2 people. He held expertise, and he held a child. He had both competence and constraint. A small sound, a child's breath against her lip, reminded Richard of Lonnie's presence. She leaned into Darius's thigh, eyelids heavy, trusting the man with her life. Richard felt the soft thud of something in his chest, recognition that sometimes seeing is the first form of help. He could hear himself making calculations, time, payroll, liability, the potential for getting caught in a policy bind. He could also hear the scrap of humanness that wanted to do more than calculate. He had choices available, concrete ones, that would not fix everything but could change the immediate odds. Flexible scheduling, contacting HR discreetly for options, a temporary stipend, enrollment in an internal training program that could be started without demanding upfront payment. He had the ability to call for a meeting that might shift a person's entire horizon. It wouldn't be magic. It wouldn't erase the past. It would, however, be a practical intervention. He took a breath and looked at Mason. "Hey," he said quietly. "Can I have a word?" Mason turned, expecting the trainee to defer. Richard watched the manager's posture shift with the small surrender of someone used to direction. "Yeah," Mason answered. "You see something wrong?" Richard felt the weight of the moment like the tightness before a door opens. He could step back into the anonymity he had given himself and watch the policies play out. Or he could move forward, unmask his anonymity, and choose to change the story from the top down. The decision wasn't heroic so much as deliberate. It was simply the understanding that when you run a company, you get to decide how to use its tools. He reached up, fingers finding the rim of the cap he'd worn like a costume. The cap had softened from being worn all night. He prepared himself for the small, private action that would alter the room's axis. Around him, the kitchen held its breath. Knife poised, child leaning, manager folding rules like paper. When he pulled the cap off, it felt like taking off more than a hat. It felt like stepping out of a role into a responsibility he had chosen long before he'd ever stood in a prep room at 3 a.m. He let the gesture hang there, the cap in his hand, the fluorescent light striking his face. The room waited, not for fireworks, but for a sentence to land and a decision to be made. He set the cap on the table and let the word "Mark" sit between them like a small lie peeled off. The fluorescent light caught his face and the kitchen watched. Knives rested in silence. The radio hummed. Lonnie breathed against Darius's leg. For a beat, the room held its breath, waiting for the punchline, the trainee who'd been playing at being something he wasn't. "I'm not a trainee," Richard said. The sentence was plain and steady. "My name is Richard Holston. I own Harvest Lane Beastro." The sound of the admission landed in the prep room like a dropped pan. Mason's eyebrows rose. A few people shifted in the doorway, as if the air had moved and they needed to find their balance. Darius blinked, a small, precise movement that carried a hum of guarded expectation. He had heard stories, PR stunts, surprise inspections, owners with quick temper and quicker memos. The kitchen had a memory for those things. It kept them like old burn marks on the stove. "You're the owner?" Mason asked, voice halfway between disbelief and recalculation. "That's right," Richard said. He kept his hands visible. He did not make a show of it. He did not hold up a checkbook or a camera. He simply closed the space between outsider and responsibility. Darius's shoulders tensed, not sure whether to brace for reprimand or relief. "So, what now?" he asked. Richard looked at the 10-year-old curled into a hoodie by the table. Then he looked at the bandaged hand, the careful slices, the labeled container of fruit. He thought of forms and liability and memos. He thought of the way a company's rules often become a wall between procedure and people. He also felt the specific acute thing that had pulled him across town that night, seeing a black chef working at 3 a.m. and discovering why he never went to college. The title of the moment was not a headline to him so much as a responsibility. "You can relax," Richard said, and he meant it. "You're not getting fired tonight. No one is calling anyone. But we're going to do something about this. I'm going to make sure you don't have to choose like this anymore." Darius let out a small laugh that was equal parts skepticism and a habit of disbelief. "I've heard promises before," he said. "People talk, but when the bills due, talk don't pay the landlord." "Fair," Richard answered. "I don't want to give you a speech. I want to give you options. Right now, I'm going to arrange for an immediate raise for you, effective next paycheck. We're also going to enroll you in our internal culinary training program and pay for the certification courses you were talking about. We'll also find childcare options for Lonnie, so she doesn't have to be in the storage room at night. And I'm going to set up a meeting with HR first thing tomorrow to make sure we handle this without putting you or Lonnie at risk. The words fell like tools put down on the table, concrete, practical. Mason's mouth opened slightly, the kind of surprised shift that happens when someone reassigns the rules of a room. You realize what that could mean for payroll? Mason said, not as a challenge so much as the reflex of someone who manages the books the way a captain watches the horizon. We're already tight. I do, Richard said. I've been watching the horizon for a long time. This is not a unilateral decision. This is me using the levers I have to keep a good worker and to keep a kid safe. We'll figure the rest out. But we're not punishing someone for trying to hold a family together. There was a silence threaded with the practicalities of the suggestion. Among the cooks and prep staff, murmurs moved like steam. Someone muttered a quiet, grateful, "About time," and then clamped a hand over their mouth. Kitchens learned quickly that news travels faster than orders. Darius stared at Richard for a long time, as if checking whether the man was different from the type who made promises. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." Richard met his gaze. "Because I do know you," he said. "I know what you're doing here. I know how good you are with a knife. I know what you've given up. And because I run the company, I get to choose how we treat people who are running their lives by doing what's right for the ones they love." It wasn't a grand speech. It wasn't meant to be. It was honesty offered and received. Darius's eyes burned slightly with the shock of being seen without having to sell the worst of his life for sympathy. There was a dignity in that. Simple, unadorned recognition. "All right," Mason said, rolling his shoulders as if he could move the policy into a new shape. "Let's do it right. You want me to call HR now?" "If you can get them on the line, yes," Richard said. "But do it quietly. I don't want to create panic or a spectacle. I want to get someone who can walk through options with Darius. Training enrollment, payroll adjustment for a raise, and any company-sponsored childcare assistants or vetted community childcare partners we work with. And set up a private meeting with me in the morning." Mason stepped away to the side and fumbled for his phone. He spoke in a clipped voice that slid into manager speak. Names, availability, a quick mention of sensitivity. A short, measured conversation followed. Richard watched it unfold like a small scene he had scripted in his head but never thought to perform. Darius's hands idly rearranged the slices on the board. Lonnie tucked a foot under her and watched with the ambivalent curiosity of a child. "You're serious about the training?" he asked, voice low. "Yes," Richard said. "You can start the apprenticeship program we run. We'll cover tuition and certification fees. We can stagger the schedule so you can still work while you train. And we'll provide a child care stipend to cover after-school care and evenings, at least while we get this set up. And I'm going to make sure HR knows tonight that none of this should be handled in a way that scares you or Lonnie off." Darius exhaled. The exhale came like a releasing of a held breath. For the first time in a while, something that resembled hope threaded through his skepticism. "Promise you won't—" Darius started, and then stopped. The rest of what he wanted to say seemed too fragile to put into language. There were fears that the system would respond with levies and inquiries that felt like punishments. There were nights when he had pictured a social worker knocking and taking Lonnie away. Those images had a weight that never quite lifted. "If anything comes up that could put you both at risk," Richard said, "I will personally make sure we handle it with discretion and care. No social service shows. We will offer support, connect you with proper child care, and get you on a path toward certification and better wages. But I will not force a situation that tears you apart more. I'm asking you to trust me. I know that's a big ask." Darius's jaw worked. The word trust had edges. He had learned not to trust quickly. But there was a measure in Richard's voice, a steady managerial certainty softened by something human. That combination felt different from the parade of voices promising help without follow-through. "Okay," Darius said. "Okay, I can try." "That's all I want," Richard answered. "Try. We will meet tomorrow morning with HR. Tonight, go home. Take Lonnie with you. If you need, we can cover a taxi or give you an advance. No judgment." The practicalness of the offer, money to get home, a cover to prevent the child from staying at the restaurant, cut through the momentum of promises with the economy of action. Mason had already thumped a few keys, and the screen at his hip glowed with personnel directories. He arranged a modest payroll advance with a professional efficiency that suggested this was not the first time an employee had needed a bridge to the next paycheck. Richard watched Darius gather his belongings. Lonnie clung to him for a second, and then slipped a small thank you into his ear so soft Richard couldn't catch it. It was real enough. The two of them moved toward the door like a small island stepping into rougher water, and for the first time the water didn't look as cold. Outside, the night air bit at their faces. The city smelled of exhaust and fried food and rain that had not yet fallen. Richard walked them to a cab and made sure they got in. He gave Darius a piece of paper with a phone number, HR's direct line, and told him simply to call. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't make it into a spectacle. Back in the kitchen, with the light above the prep table now a dull witness, Mason leaned against the counter and exhaled. "You sure about him?" he asked, meaning Darius and the whole of the commitment. "Yes," Richard said. "And we're going to make sure this isn't just a one-night rescue. We will set measures, training, scheduling flex, a childcare stipend, and then we'll revisit. This isn't charity. It's an investment in a person who has already proven their value with their hands and their heart." Mason nodded slowly, the weight of his managerial posture easing into something like agreement. "All right. We'll make this clean. I don't want this to turn into a mess of paperwork that ends up messing up his life more. We'll be careful," Richard said, "and we'll do it with dignity." They walked through the restaurant together, the owner and the manager, quiet in the kitchen's afterglow. Richard felt the small human satisfaction of making a decision that matched his belief, seeing someone and choosing to act. It wasn't theatrical. It was work, a phone call, a commitment, a change in payroll codes. It was also the kind of decision employers rarely get praised for, and even more rarely get asked to do. The next morning, the meeting with HR was private and quiet. HR's representative was a woman named Aisha, who had been with the company a decade and carried the particular steady competence of someone who had handled crises and victories in equal measure. She listened without surprise when Richard explained the night, without the camera crews, without the soundbite, only the facts, the observation, the commitment he wanted to keep. "First thing," she said, "we need to make sure Darius feels safe. We'll open a confidential file, set up training enrollment, and approve a payroll adjustment for an immediate raise. We have partnerships with a couple of vetted childcare providers in the neighborhood. We can authorize a stipend while we get him placed. We'll also connect him with the apprenticeship coordinator so his schedule can be flexible while he trains." Richard watched as each item became a checkbox on her tablet. There was a clean efficiency to the way she framed help. There was also a caution. "We need to be clear with him about the process," she said. "Paperwork and enrollment require signatures. There may be forms to fill out that ask about guardianship. We have to handle those gently. The last thing we want is to put his family in a worse spot." "I don't want anyone making decisions for him," Richard said. "I want options offered. I want to make sure he's the one who chooses what steps to take." "Understood," Aisha said. "We'll be discreet. We'll offer the childcare partners we've vetted. We'll start the training enrollment, cover the fees, and set up bi-weekly check-ins to make sure the schedule is working for him." They crafted a plan that was practical, not miraculous. It had steps. It required Darius to participate. It required the company to follow through. It committed resources but did not promise perfection. That balance, help without pretense, was what Richard wanted. It felt right. That afternoon, after paperwork had begun and Mason had tucked a note into Darius's pay file, Richard walked back into the prep room. The kitchen was busier now, simmering with the attention of a day shift. Darius stood at the edge of the line, sleeves rolled, knife flashing with the same practiced precision. He moved like someone whose work was part of the scaffolding of his life, steady, necessary. Richard watched from a doorway, not intervening, giving the man space to be himself. When Darius glanced up and saw him, he didn't come forward immediately. He kept chopping, letting the rhythm of the board speak. Then he set the knife down and walked over. "They're going to start the training enrollment this week," Richard said. "HR set up a childcare stipend. Payroll's processed the raise. It'll show on your next check. I want you to know this isn't a PR stunt. This is a commitment. Darius's expression wavered between skepticism and the small light that comes when a locked door clicks open. You sure none of this means some social worker shows up and takes Lonnie? He asked, voice tight at the edges. No, Richard replied. Nothing like that. We're not making this a spectacle. We're offering support. We want to help you get certified and paid like you deserve. We'll handle everything through HR and our community partners. If you want any part of it, you sign. If you don't, we'll revisit and adjust. It's your life. That choice, the ability to accept or decline assistance without being punished, mattered to Darius more than almost anything. It preserved his agency. It kept the dignity of his decision intact. He looked at Lonnie, who was sitting with another staff member in the front booth coloring quietly. Then he looked back at Richard. Thank you, he said, the two words compressed with years of withheld relief. You're welcome, Richard said. Now go home. Make pancakes. Darius blinked, surprised by the domestic ordinariness of the instruction. Pancakes? Yeah, Richard said with a small smile. Go make pancakes. Eat with your sister. We'll get on the rest tomorrow. That night, Darius did just that. The apartment he and Lonnie shared was small and smelled faintly of coffee and the lemon cleaner he used on the counters. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Darius stood at the stove in a t-shirt and an apron that had been washed clean for once, flipping pancakes with the sort of care usually reserved for rights. Lonnie, hair tied in two uneven ponytails, giggled as batter spatters made constellation patterns on the stove. There was an ordinary joy in the air, the kind that arrives when life feels less like a stunt and more like a series of manageable decisions. You sure about this, Da? Lonnie asked, her spoon tapping at a plate. Yeah, he said. We got folks helping us out. Like who? Like a guy named Richard who owns the place I work. He says they'll help me learn to be a chef. He promised. That means maybe I can keep my job and go to school at the same time. Lonnie's face tilted, trying to measure the promise on some child scale. You mean you'll be a real chef? Like on TV? Darius laughed softly. Maybe not on TV, but a real chef. Someone who reads recipes and makes people say, wow. Lonnie made a show of being impressed. Wow, chef, she repeated, and the sound filled the small kitchen with something warm. The pancakes tasted better because they were shared. The room had no cameras, no audience, just two people rebuilding the ordinary. Back at the restaurant that week, the practical measures unfolded. The apprenticeship coordinator met with Darius and hashed out a schedule that would allow him to complete modules on technique and sanitation without losing crucial shifts. Aisha from HR arranged for a local vetted childcare provider to cover after-school care, with a company stipend bridging the cost for the first months. Mason adjusted shift patterns so Darius could attend morning classes on certain days while keeping steady hours. It wasn't seamless at first. There were scheduling overlaps and confusion about forms, but the company moved to correct its missteps instead of walking away from them. Word spread among the staff, not as gossip but as a small encouragement. People began to watch for openings to cover shifts when Darius had classes. The line cooks adjusted their prep. The front-of-house staff volunteered a pickup routine when traffic snarled. It was the kind of informal mutual aid kitchens dream about but seldom get to experience on the clock. Darius attended his first training module and surprised himself and others by how quickly he absorbed the techniques. Knife cuts that had been born of necessity turned into sharpened craft. He listened to instructors and asked precise questions. He practiced a sauce until his fingers imprinted its rhythm. Someone on the line, one of the cooks he had worked with only months, said to him quietly, "Man, you were always this good." Darius's face flushed with a humility that felt like both pride and exasperation at wasted assumption. Skill unrecognized because life had made him invisible. There were moments of awkwardness. An audit required signatures. A paperwork misstep forced a temporary pause in the stipend. Darius called Richard, exasperated, worried, angry. Richard answered every time. He did not solve every bureaucratic stop overnight, but he did not let the company hide behind procedure either. He pressed his HR staff to prioritize the case and to keep Darius informed. Each small correction reinforced the message that help here would be practical and persistent. A month later, at a modest staff meeting, Richard stood before the team not as Mark, but as the company's owner. He spoke softly, not about himself, but about what he had seen. A young man in a prep room at 3 a.m., a child hidden in the storage room, the kinds of choices that go unremarked in the nightly paperwork. He used no grand rhetoric. He told it plainly. We have a responsibility to our employees that goes beyond clocks and memos. People who work for us are people first. When someone is doing the work and carrying responsibility that would break many of us, we bend the levers we have. After the meeting, a few employees lingered to talk, not to praise, but to offer what everyone in a small ecosystem offers each other: support. Someone from the front of house handed Darius a therapy referral for free counseling available through the company's benefits. Someone in HR suggested a sliding map of community resources they could access without invasive forms. The small network tightened. Darius finished his basic certification in sanitation and started on culinary techniques. He still worked nights, but not the impossible all-night shifts that had once been his default. Lonnie's afternoons were filled with an after-school program that included homework help and a snack before Richard's stipend covered the rest of the care. Lonnie made new friends and brought show and tell to the restaurant one day, proudly displaying a drawing of a pancake and a chef's hat. There were no dramatic pronouncements of life changed overnight. There were still tough stretches, bills that needed juggling, nights when Darius felt stretched thin and tired. But the regular hum of support had shifted the math of their days. The neighborhood's small kindnesses, combined with the company's concrete measures, altered the odds in a way that steady work rarely does. They gave a family time and a path. One evening, a few months after the first night Richard had walked into the prep room, Darius came into the owner's office with a small triumph. His first graded practical exam from the training program, a sheet marked with commendations. He placed it on Richard's desk and grinned like a man who had just been given permission to believe again. You did this, Richard told him, genuinely pleased. You put the time in. We just tried to remove some of the obstacles. Darius leaned back in the chair, the accomplishment settling into his shoulders like an earned weight. Feels good, he said. Feels like maybe I can go all the way. Then let's plan the next steps, Richard said. More advanced modules, some stage time in the kitchen, maybe exposure to a few of our concept restaurants. We'll build it together. And they did. Not perfectly, not without hiccups, but with a steadiness that came from follow-through. Richard's closing of the restaurant that night was quieter than the night he had first walked in disguised as Mark. He walked the floor, checking lights, listening to the hum of the equipment settling down. He saw staff leave in pairs, laughing, trading recipes. He thought of the woman at HR, the manager who had folded a policy to make room for a person, and of Darius folding his life around his sister. He felt something like gratitude for having the capacity to make decisions that ripple. Out on the sidewalk, he paused under the neon of the Harvest Lane sign. The city breathed around him, cars moving, lights blinking, a late street vendor packing up. In his pocket was a small business card he had given to Darius's landlord contact when they had needed verification for the childcare subsidy. The card felt like a small, responsible thing, the kind of paper that does not make headlines, but does the work. He thought of the moment that had drawn him in. A solitary rhythm of a knife at 3 a.m., a small container of fruit, a child in a storage room. He had come looking for problems to fix and found instead a life negotiating survival. The difference between the two frames had been a responsibility, seeing someone not as a line item on a report, but as a person with talents and obligations. He remembered the title of that first small thought. Undercover boss saw a black chef working at 3 a.m., then discovered why he never went to college. The phrase had fit into the shape of the night, but the narrative it named had been more complex than a line in a headline. The reason Darius had never gone to college was not a failure of ambition. It was the arithmetic of caregiving and medical cost, and a decision to prioritize a child's safety over a deferred promise. It was a kind of adulthood that did not require permission. If Richard could shape anything out of that, he decided it would be this. Employment is not only about output, it is also about the lives that sustain that output. An employer who recognizes the fullness of employees' lives is an employer who can make targeted, realistic interventions that change odds. He locked the door and paused one last time, looking back at the warm rectangle of light through the front window. Darius had walked out weeks ago with pancakes in his future and training in his schedule. He had not been cured of life's troubles by a single act. But he had been seen. He had been offered choices and the dignity to choose them. Richard got into his car and drove away, thinking of how many places like Harvest Lane were filled with people whose stories circled reasons and responsibilities. Not every owner would act. Not every story would bend toward help. But in this corner of the neighborhood, one man's decision had shifted a life from a simple ledger of deficit to a ledger that accounted for skill, care, and possibility. If you watch this and it moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is to notice and to act with both the humility and the resources we have. Seeing someone and offering real, practical help can change what they believe is possible. Remember his face in the dim prep room, the steady rhythm of the knife, the labeled fruit container, the child who trusted her brother. And remember that the small courtesies of policy and practice can be the difference between a life stalled and a life set in motion. Change often begins when someone sees, chooses, and follows through.